This is one of Stabila's new extendable levels. They call it an XTL, and let me tell you, this thing is really handy. When you're setting doors, one of the most important things you have to do is make sure the sill is perfectly level before you bring the frame in. And this level is ideal for that solution because you can take the level and stretch it exactly from rough opening to rough opening and level up your 2 points. You can use it to get a pretty straight line too, and that's all you need when you're setting doors. In the first program, I demonstrated how to install a single door. And in the second program, I demonstrated how to install a single door with a pair of side lights. And in this program, we're going to demonstrate how to install a pair of doors. And for a pair of doors, just like all the others, you always start at the bottom. You've got to make sure that the sill is perfectly level before you bring your frame into the rough opening. You can't level it afterwards because once you put your sealant down, you can't put shims underneath it. So I always install a cant strip. It makes it easier to prepare the sill in the rough opening. A cant strip is simple. I showed it in the previous programs. It's just a pad strip that'll lift your doors up a little bit, and that way they'll clear a throw rug too. And the cant strip has a chamfer to it that'll drain any water outside. So I use the cant strip to help level up the rough opening. Put my level on, and if I need to install a shim under one side or the other to get this bubble vial perfectly centered, I'll do it right now. And then I'll fasten the cant strip down to the rough opening. In this case, this one's already perfectly level, so all I have to do is fasten this down with a couple of screws. So with the cant strip fastened down, I'm ready to waterproof this rough opening. I'm not going to do it in this program because I've done it a couple of times before, but when I say waterproof, I mean it's time to put down some kind of a waterproof peel and stick membrane, something that's self-healing. I like to use a flexible membrane. That way when you put the membrane down to create your sill pan, you can lift your legs up and just push the membrane around the corners. If you're not certain what I'm talking about here, watch one of the previous videos on door hanging and you'll see this technique explicitly. So right now, we're ready to correct the rough opening. And there's two things we have to correct on a rough opening. Once we get the sill prepped and it's level, there's two things we have to correct on the rough opening: the width of the opening and any cross leg that might occur between the two walls. Let's talk about the cross leg next. When you install a pair of doors, you got to make sure that the opening is completely corrected for cross leg, because cross leg is one of the most problematic issues you're going to face with a pair of doors. And to correct for cross leg on a pair, I always use a string. We get this on here pretty taut. There we go. Just let that hang. We want these two strings to just touch each other like these are doing. Just touching. Now, you're not going to see this on any opening, on any home you ever go to install doors on. It'll never happen. This is a set wall. I built this thing in my shop. It's skinned on both sides with plywood. It's perfectly in one plane. And that is something you're not going to see on a job site. What you're going to see is walls where the bottoms of the walls are out a little bit. One's going to be a little bit in this direction, the other's going to be a little in that direction, or vice versa. That's called cross leg. Now the top of the wall is going to be in one plane because there's a big long header connecting it. But the bottom of the wall, the bottoms get out of cross leg, and that's what we want to correct, and that's what this string will reveal on a job site. It'll tell you that you need to move that wall a little bit that way, and this wall a little bit this way. And when I say move the wall a little, I mean move the wall. I use a single jack, a little short sledgehammer like this, and a block of 2x, and just give that wall a little smack. You might want to move it a little that way, or you might want to smack it from this side to get these strings so that they just touch. And now that we've corrected cross leg, we're ready to correct the rough opening. When I say correct the rough opening, I mean correct the rough opening width. These days, framers frame rough openings almost 2.5 inches over the size of the doors, which is way too big to use shims when you're installing the frames. I mean, I've seen a lot of finish guys come up to a rough opening and put a big pile of shims like this right on top of the trimmers of the jack studs and then nail through them. Let's understand something about shims. Shims are really, really critical and valuable tools when we're installing doors and cabinets and stuff, but they serve a specific purpose. They're designed to make minor adjustments in the fit of things. They're not meant to make gross adjustments like stacking a bunch of them up like this. As soon as you stack a bunch of shims up on a wall like this, on an opening like this, and you put a nail through them, you can no longer use them to adjust anything. So they're no longer serving a valuable purpose. I don't use tapered shims for making rough adjustments and corrections in my rough opening sizes. I use plywood shims to make major corrections in rough opening widths. Plywood shims are so much easier to work with when you have to bring an opening down a lot. I have 1/4 inch shims that I've got 3/8, I've got 5/8, I've got 1/2 inch. These are all scraps off of job sites that I rip to 3.5 inches, and then I cross cut to 3.5 inches, and I store them in a milk crate. In my milk crate, I've got my block of 2x, I've got my single jack, I've got a whole bunch of different plywood shims, and all kinds of tapered shims too. Whenever I install a door or cabinets, all I gotta do is grab this milk crate and I'm ready to go. So I've got a 3/8 shim at the top of this rough opening, and I got a 1/4 inch shim at the bottom. And on this side, I got a 3/8 on the bottom and a 1/4 inch on the top. Exactly the opposite of what's happening over there, and that's because this rough opening is out of plumb. It's kind of a parallelogram. But I've shimmed the opening so it's perfectly plumb, and I've been careful when I shimmed it too. I always check from shim to shim to make sure that I still have enough room for my frame. I like the rough opening I like to correct the rough opening so that the size is about 1/8 of an inch wider from shim to shim than the OD, the jamb. Hook your tape measure on your jamb on your frame and measure how wide it is. You really should measure it at the very top, right across the head jamb, or measure it at the very bottom. And this one measures 62 inches, and I've got 62 1/8 from this shim to this shim. So I'm ready now to install the frame. Now remember, I kind of skipped a step a little bit just for this demonstration because I've covered it so many times in previous videos. But before you can put your frame in, you have to put down a sill pan on top of your cant strip. And before you put your frame in, you have to lay down a good bead of sealant on top of that sill pan. Now that bead of sealant should run on the inside of your wall, all the way across, about 1/2 inch thick. That bead should be really pretty thick, so when you set your frame on top of the sill pan, it's bedded nicely in that sealant. Don't use an adhesive. Adhesives like polyurethane floor adhesives dry crystalline hard and they're not flexible. You have to use some kind of a door or window adhesive. Quad Max is a perfect choice because it adheres to almost anything, whether it's wet, dry, hot, cold, doesn't matter. It'll adhere, and the joint that you create with this sealant is incredibly flexible. Now we're ready. Once that sealant goes down on top of the sill pan and that waterproof membrane, now we're ready to really set the frame. So now all I want to do is set this frame in here so it's flush with the walls at the top, right across the head. And I can do that and pin it into place with just a few shims. But I want to place those shims carefully right across the head jamb. Just a couple on this side and a couple over on this side too. And that's all it'll take to pin that frame in and hold it still. And you'll notice I'm setting the frame without the doors in it. Boy, that makes it a lot easier. Don't make things tough, you know? A finished guy shouldn't be fighting things. Take the doors off the frame if the unit came pre-assembled completely, and set the frame first so you can tweak it in just the way you want it before you swing the doors on it. Once you get that jamb perfectly flush, you can put in fasteners number 1 and 2. They go in the very top of the jamb. Now I'm using big flat-headed screws here because this is just a demonstration I use over and over again at shows. You're going to probably shoot nails, or you're going to pre-drill and countersink a screw right behind where the kerf-in weather stripping goes. But this is the location where you want to put in your first fasteners. Your second fasteners go exactly on the opposite side of the frame. So fastener number 2 goes right in here, right on the opposite side of the frame. And all I'm trying to do is secure the frame so it's perfectly flush with the head. And that'll make it a lot easier to get the casing on. And remember, the wall is always in one plane across the top. So flush up your jamb with your drywall first, right at the head, and then work the bottom. And of course, you can't work the bottom and correct for cross-leg down here until the doors are swinging. So let me get the doors on the hinges right now. Now I've got the doors hung on the hinges, and we're ready to correct for cross-leg before we install fasteners 3 and 4. You want to make sure that the meeting stiles on these doors are perfectly flush. On a pair of doors, this is really, really critical. And there's only one way to make that correction, and that's to correct cross-leg at the bottoms of both jambs before you put any fasteners in. So if you're starting your installations by putting shims behind the hinges and nailing through the jamb through those shims, you're defeating your ability to correct for cross-leg. You're defeating your ability to bring these meeting stiles perfectly flush. So I'm going to tell you one more time, as I've said it in all the other videos on door hanging, do not install shims behind your hinges and nail them off at the beginning. You can do that when you're all done, but you can't do it until you've finished the first 5 or 6 fasteners. So let's correct for cross-leg right now. This door here is coming up and hitting the stop at the top, but it's sticking out at the bottom just a little bit. I can correct that just by taking this jamb and kicking it in maybe a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch. And the same on this side. I can take this side and kick it out just a little bit, and now the door is going to come up and hit perfectly flush top to bottom, and I'm ready to install fastener number 3. Fasteners number 3 and number 4 have to be driven at the very bottom of the jamb. This is going to be really important in a few minutes, and you'll see why. Now let's install fastener number 4. Fastener number 4 goes on the opposite jamb leg all the way at the bottom of the jamb. And that's fastener number 4. Again, it's driven at the very bottom of the jamb leg. Now let's go around the other side and take a look at our gaps. This is what your door should look like when you get your first 4 fasteners in. Fastener number 1, fastener number 2, fastener number 3, and fastener number 4. They should be all in one plane so your meeting stiles are perfectly flush. And your gaps should be pretty close between your 2 doors from the top to the bottom. And let's look at this really closely now. You really should have a fairly tight gap at this point right between the meeting stiles at the top. And at the bottom, you should have a little bit of a fat gap, a little bit wider at the bottom, because you're going to make 2 critical adjustments at this point. And those adjustments are going to have an impact on the gap between the 2 doors. The first adjustments you're going to make are what I call fastener number 5. And with a pair of doors, you're actually putting in fastener number 5 and 6. And those fasteners go behind the top hinge. Let's look at that right now. Notice the gap above the top hinge here is too big. The reason the gap above the top hinge is too big is because all the weight of the door is hanging on that hinge. This hinge is under tension, and it's not only the hinge that's being pulled on, it's the jamb too. Now look at this. If this were a door that had glass in it, or a solid core exterior door, it'd weigh a lot more. If I put a little of my weight on this door right here, I can change that gap dramatically. And that's what I mean. This hinge is under tension. We got to take the tension off that hinge. And that's what fastener number 5 is for. Fastener number 5 is just a long screw that goes through the top hinge and grabs that whole jamb and pulls it back to the trimmer or the king stud or the jack stud. I just put a little bit of torque on that top screw. If I torque that thing down too much, I'll close the gap up completely above the top hinge. And then the door could end up being jam bound or hinge bound or something. Now, let's go put fastener number 6 into that top hinge on the opposite door. Again, I'm only torquing that screw down a little bit. I don't want to close those gaps up. But I do want to take the weight of the door off the jamb and off the top hinge. Let's go see what we did to those gaps now. So now we've got a nice gap above this hinge, and we've got a nice gap above this one. You'll notice this real quick. If the gap is too tight, loosen that screw up a little bit. And pay attention to the gap between your doors too. And this is what I mean by you wanted them a little bit tight to start with. Notice how the gap here is now just right. That's because I took a little weight off the door with this screw, and I took a little bit of the weight off this door with the screw in the top hinge on this side, and that pulled both the doors apart a little bit right at the meeting stiles. So you got to kind of plan for that when you're installing the doors. And you got to plan for the next adjustment too. You're going to close this gap up too when you open up the gaps below the bottom hinges on both sides of the door. Notice how the gap below the bottom hinge is too tight. That's because the bottom hinge is under compression. The weight of the door is pushing down on this hinge, and it's closing up this gap. It might even be putting a belly in the jamb right here and forcing it back toward the trimmer or the jack stud. There's only one way to correct this. If you put your shims in above the top hinge and your fastener is driven way low on that jamb leg, you have maximum leverage and maximum adjustability here on this gap. Like I said, if your fasteners are going through shims that are placed behind the hinges, then you can't make this correction. But notice how easy it is to correct with these shims and to open up that gap. And when you do it, remember, you're pushing your whole jamb in this direction, so you're closing up the gap between the meeting stiles too. Now let's correct for the hinge gap on the opposite door, and then we'll see how tight we're getting right in here. Look how tight the gap is right here between the door and the jamb. It's almost jam bound on the opposite door. We've got to correct that before we go any further, and it's just like the opposite side. We're going to put our shim in just above. We only need 2 of them on this side. Perfect. Now let's see what impact we've had on the gap between the meeting stiles. Oh, this is awesome. Look at this. We made this little tiny adjustment in the gaps beneath the bottom hinges, and look, it closed up the gaps between the doors when we did that. So now the gap between the meeting stiles is perfect all the way from the top to the bottom. The doors are perfectly flush when we close them, and we're ready to put in the rest of the shims and the fasteners. And that's the easy part. I mean, at this point, all you want to do is shim the jamb like crazy all over the place, especially since this is a Plas-Pro jamb. It's a polyfiber jamb, and it's really flexible. So you want to put in pairs of shims, and I like to do this above and below the hinges, not right behind them, because anytime you put a shim right behind a hinge, you can't make any adjustments down the road. So I always shim above the hinges and below the hinges about every 12 to 16 inches. And when I'm talking about making adjustments down the road, you know, fastener number 5 and fastener number 6, those 2 long screws, you can always tighten those up down the road. Let's say the 2 doors are starting to touch each other in the middle because the house settled. Or if it's a single door and it's starting to rub a little bit on the strike jamb near the top of the door, you can tighten up that long screw, fastener number 5 and fastener number 6, and pull that door away from the strike jamb just that quick, as long as you don't have any shims behind your hinges. Now let's look at one more area on a pair of doors that's really critical. We want to correct the head gap up here. And now you can see the jamb is still loose. It needs to be shimmed too. So at this point, you can shim the head jamb and get your gap across the tops of the 2 doors just perfect. And when you drive your nails through the jamb, don't nail through that shim. Anytime you put a nail through a jamb and through the shim, The shim's no longer a microfine adjustment tool. You put a nail through it. So never nail through your shims, because I've found every time I do, I end up having to get a Sawzall and cut the nails off so I can make some minor adjustment before I put the casing on. Right now, what we want to do is we want to drill for this flush bolt. We've got a flush bolt on the top of the door and the bottom of the door, but we need to drill a hole for this bolt right through the jamb. And that hole has to be located dead on. So when you throw your flush bolt into the jamb, the inactive door doesn't rattle around. And there's one really good trick I know of for making sure that hole is positioned perfectly. I make a little locator out of sheet metal or tin shingle or something like that, and I bend an L in it, and I drill a hole, a 3/8 inch hole, right through the end of it like this. Nice. So let's review here real quickly what the fastening system is. Once you get your frame into the opening and it's flush across the top, put in fasteners 1 and 2 as high on the jamb as you can. And then check your doors. Before you put in fasteners 3 and 4, right at the bottom of the hinge jambs, make sure that your doors are perfectly flush. You want to correct for any cross leg or any warp in the doors at that point. Now remember, doors can be warped 1/4 of an inch and they're still, within warranty. So that is your responsibility as a finished carpenter to make sure that the doors meet flush at the stiles, and the only way to do it is by correcting for cross leg on the bottom jambs before you put in fasteners 3 and 4. And now it's time to put in fastener 5 and 6 with a pair. And those are the long screws that go through the top hinges to correct for all the weight that's on the top hinge and a large hinge gap that you always get on every door above the top hinge. And finally, the last thing you want to do with every door is check the gap below the bottom hinge and make sure that you've got some down there and the doors aren't pinching on the jamb. And the only way to correct that is with these shims right above the bottom hinges. And once that's done, it's all downhill from there. It's just shimming and adjusting gaps and adjusting your shims until all your gaps are nice and parallel and even all the way around the door.